What we are looking at, that obelisk there, is Wilson Swain Caldwell's grave. So you remember we started out near the Joseph Caldwell monument where Joseph, his wife, and her son were buried. This monument was actually the monument on top of Joseph Caldwell. As you can see, it's not as fancy as that one, and so it was taken down and put away, and the fancy granite one was put up over Joseph. The students of the class of 1891 had this statue, this monument repurposed to put over the body of Wilson Swain Caldwell when he died in 1898. So the monument that was originally on the president of the university is now on the grandson, well, the son of his slave, right, November's son. So this is also, I believe, the tallest monument in the graveyard. Not just, if you see there's a wall there, we're surrounded by wall here. That wall is the wall that segregates the graveyard. Everybody buried between that wall and this wall is black, with half an exception. Everybody buried on the other side is white. Until you get, and I don't know this, but at the very end of the graveyard, you can be sprinkled, right? We now have an ashes field for all of us Carolina people, which is nice. You know, the Ackland Art Museum is at Carolina because Duke wouldn't allow a non-Duke person to be buried on their campus. If you go in the Ackland Art Museum and go in the cloakroom, that's where Mr. Ackland is buried, in a sarcophagus. So we're not exclusive, we're democratic. So this is a segregated graveyard, and this is completely full, by the way. This is completely owned. Every plot on this side is owned. I notice people then move. Recently, the Chapel Hill Preservation Society did some ground penetrating radar and electrostatic tests to try to figure out where the graves are. Because enslaved people, there are probably a lot of people buried here. They got stones. Well, you'll notice there's an old buried wall here. The stones are probably stones that used to be gravestones. People moved around. The graveyard probably goes under that road too, right? I mean, that wall was rebuilt fairly recently. But so Wilson, I'll explain one mystery. I said there's half a person, half a white person here. That bench over there behind the yucca, the green stuff, there's a bench. That bench is the grave of a man named Lightning Brown, who was a local community activist. He was big in the greenways. He was with the water board here. When he died, he asked to desegregate the graveyard. So half of his ashes were sprinkled there. Now, why only half? Well, I told you he's big on the greenways. He's big on kind of the natural part of Chapel Hill. The other half of him is buried in the Chapel Hill Community Park, right across from University Mall. You know, where the apartments are that flood all the time? There's a park, and there's a rose garden, and there is a monument that is the shape of a hand that you can sit in. So you can sit on this bench, and you can sit in the hand. And there was the first monument in North Carolina to specify somebody's sexual identity. Well, the first to say somebody was gay. I assume there are other ones that have your sexual identity. But so he's gay in that identity, and he's white in this identity. And I think it's interesting that in the 20th century, the late 20th century, you still had to split those identities. He wasn't going to be a gay white man here or a desegregating gay man over there. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Well, I suppose you could, but there's no asterisk next to the story. See, you've all learned something from this. But Wilson Swain Caldwell, I think this is a much better monument, personally, than the Unsung Founders Monument. Because if you go to the other side, I know a lot of people don't like trekking through graveyards, but on the other side, at the bottom, is a plaque. And it says, dedicated to the memory of Wilson Swain Caldwell, who lies here, November Caldwell, David Barham, and Henry Smith. So it names names for men who were slaves and then employees of the university after the end of slavery. Only Wilson is buried there. The students chose to bury him there. Julian Carr, by the way, came to his funeral. We know a lot about Wilson because he wrote notes, and then there was a biography written of him by President Battle and a couple other local people. So he's fairly well known. The bad thing about the monument, though, is he didn't get to pick what happened to him when he died. He was memorialized outside of his own wishes. And I say that because the rest of his family is buried right over there. And this is where I'm going to end the tour. Wilson Swain Caldwell was born in slavery, right? He was born basically in the Arboretum, because that was where Swain's house was at the time, and the enslaved people lived out back. He was born in slavery. He was raised on the campus as a slave. He worked together with President Swain's son, Robert. They both worked in the grounds, but Robert, of course, went on to go to school, and Wilson became a janitor on campus. When the Civil War ended in 1865, Wilson became a paid employee at the university. He also opened up one of the first black schools, one of the first schools for black children in Chapel Hill at the corner of Rosemary and Henderson. He went to Eastern North Carolina and had a school for black children there where he was the principal. He worked for Julian Carr for a year in Durham as his driver. But he moved back to Chapel Hill after the university reopened after Reconstruction, and was famously quoted as saying, "Durham is no place for a literary man." It's kind of an interesting quotation, and one that we should use more often. But he moved back and became the head janitor of the campus. He became a fairly well-to-do man. He, in fact, at the time of his death, owned 12 acres in Chapel Hill. And his descendants still own property in Chapel Hill. If you do Orange County GIS, you'll find Caldwells who own property. And Caldwell Street in Northside is named after him. Once again, the unsung thing. Over there is the Caldwell plot. 3 of his children are buried over there, one of whom was his child who was born right after the Civil War. A little boy was born in 1868 named Edwin Caldwell. And this, for a historian, is a very interesting period, because 1870 is the first American census where the former slaves appear, right? Up until 1870, right, the 1790 to 1860 censuses, enslaved people were listed in a roster. And it said who owned you, it said if you were male or female, it said how old you were, but it didn't give you a name because you were property. But you were property that was quasi-human, right? You had to be listed because slaves counted as 3/5 of a person for representation in the Electoral College and for Congress. But you didn't need to know their names. Everybody else was listed by name. So 1870 is an exciting year because 4 million people suddenly show up with identities. So I was very excited. Edwin, born in 1868, was going to be the first Caldwell to be in the census the year he was born, or in the decade he was born. If you go over and look at that gravestone, you will see it says Dr. Edwin Caldwell. Edwin Caldwell was one of the very first black physicians in the state of North Carolina. He was educated, and remember we were talking about separate but equal between Central and UNC. Well, what was the first black university to open in the South? Anybody know? Shaw. Shaw was the very first. It opened in 1865. And it had a medical school, not right when it opened, but it was seen by Northern interests as important to create black medical professionals, right? Because obviously if black people get sick, white people are going to get sick, and So a medical school was opened called the Leonard Medical School at Shaw University. Shaw's had quite a storied history. A fascinating fact for you UNC people is that the Leonard Medical School was a 4-year medical school. UNC in that time period only gave 2 years of medical education, and then you had to go out and apprentice yourself. So if you were in the visitor center and looked around, there's a picture of the medical school where you see people dissecting a body out in the woods. That's Wilson Library area, is where the medical dissections happen. But so Edwin Caldwell shows the possibilities of Reconstruction North Carolina. This young man, born to somebody who was born in slavery, becomes a physician. And in the 1890s, that was a great thing, too, right? Like now.
Wasn't there a big black hospital issue? Or was that later?
That was later.
I remember reading vaguely about
And the same thing happened in Durham, actually, where the Duke family established a hospital because it was seen as important. But medical education is a kind of an underexplored aspect of black history that people are starting to get into. But he was born in slavery, or his father was born in slavery. He was born right at the end of slavery. He becomes a physician. He moves to Durham, which a lot of the black middle class did. He moved to Arkansas for a while, which a lot of people did not do. But he came back and was very successful. Now, first thing I'm going to tell you is when I looked in the census in 1870, this little boy was 2 3/4 years old, and his name in the census was Dr. Edwin Caldwell. That was one of those, I don't know if you've heard of the Twilight Zone, but it was one of those Twilight Zone things, because I was thinking, do census takers wait until you're dead and then go back and modify?
I have an ancestor in the 1870s as a young child whose first name was Doctor.
Well, that's the answer. His grandfather, November, was nicknamed Doc, and so his name was Dr. Edwin. But how wonderful, right? If it only worked, we'd all name our children Doctor or give them Esquire to go after their names, and then we'd know we'd be taken care of no matter what happens to Social Security. But it was quite a shock to see Dr. Edwin Caldwell as a 2.5-year-old boy, but it was his name. The second shock, though, was in doing my research. I love this project because it allows me to use so many data sources and so many things that are fun to look at. One of the things I've been using is the Yakety Yak, which if you're young, you're probably not too aware of. It's the yearbook for UNC, but yearbooks are kind of passé. One of the projects the library's been involved with has been digitizing them, so it's easier to look at. I looked at the ones in the North Carolina collection and found Edwin Caldwell Jr. Edwin Caldwell Jr. was in a Yakety Yak at UNC in the 1930s. Well, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? What was the son of a black physician doing in a yearbook of the University of North Carolina? He was the houseboy of the Deke fraternity. So when you look at the picture, you've got the Deke house, looks just like the Deke house today. There's all of the brothers, and then there's Edwin Caldwell Jr. And think of that. His grandfather was born in slavery, but makes it to become a fairly wealthy, well-to-do, and powerful man in the community. Well, I didn't tell you, Wilson was elected to the Chapel Hill Town Council in the university seat. So, I mean, he was an amazing man for his times. His son becomes a well-to-do, well-known physician. But he was born in Reconstruction. His son was born in Jim Crow. And because he wanted to stay in Chapel Hill, the best job he could get was serving UNC students. So you see the irony of going between the 1840s and the 1940s. So there's a picture in the Yakety Yak of Edwin Caldwell Jr. And I hear from students who are Dekes that that picture hangs in the Deke house and that he is a respected honorary brother. So, you know, but of course it's like how you are remembered outside. his grandson, Edwin, was on the Chapel Hill School Board. So the family kind of illustrates the various periods of American history. And, you know, it's just wonderful as a teaching tool. Like I said at the beginning, you can teach pretty much all American history by wandering around this campus. And I think it's much more visceral. You know, the mnemonics, you walk through the graveyard, and, oh yeah, we had slavery here. Is very different than the table on that side of campus. I think something over here and incorporating this more into the campus would be a very valuable thing. I will end by saying I know a few of you, because you introduced yourselves to me, are from the School of Government. The School of Government is probably one of the least visited parts of the UNC's main campus. Would you agree?
Yes.
But they're one of the most explicit and effective memorials to Black North Carolina is in the School of Government. And it is, you know, they call this the priceless gem. I think of these as the hidden gems. There is this wonderful mural of Black political activism in North Carolina right across from the cafeteria. If you go in the School of Government, ask any, well, I was going to say ask anyone. But
ask anyone who works there.
Ask anyone who works there, ask somebody at the desk, and they'll tell you to go downstairs. But you can see this really wonderful mural that includes Pauli Murray. It includes the Greensboro Four. It includes Golden Frinks, who I can't get into, but there's a lot of people, and it's an explicit discussion of Black identity on this campus. And the only other place you see that so visibly is at the football stadium. Right? It's one of the ironies. If you go to the Stone Center, if you're standing up above the Stone Center and you look, you see a giant image of a Black man. And, you know, the conflict between culture and athletics and academics is really played out there. It's not nearly so complicated at the School of Government. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. Keep exploring. If anybody wants to get up with me, I'm easy to find. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I gave you more than you asked for, but thank you very much.